And I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. It's great to see faces at the schoolhouse again. You will have noticed that we have cameras in the room because we're going to be live streaming tonight's event. So hello as well to all of you joining us online. So to start things off, I want to read a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So many of you know that this is our third round for Speaker's Corner. The name of this series is Arrival, the stories of immigrants and refugees who've come to Canada to start a new life. So They Came as Children is the first of 4 programs, and our host for Arrival is, and we're super thrilled to have him, writer and CBC Radio broadcaster, Michael Enright. Here you go, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome. Nice to see you all tonight, and welcome to the people online. You have to forgive me. I haven't worked in front of a live audience for about 3 years now. Many dead audiences, but this is the first real live audience I've worked with, given the pandemic and all that. There are a series of 4 events between now and November 15th, October 25th, November 1st, and November 15th. And what we wanted to do was to explore the whole idea of immigration, arrival, through stories told by people who've done it. I grew up not far from here, actually, so I am not a new arrival. My father's family came from Kerry, County Kerry in Ireland, pardon me, at the height of the Great Hunger. The Irish famine killed over 1 million people. But other than that, I am really unaware about the life of new Canadians and how they came to be here and why they're here. Unless you're a member of an Indigenous nation, we have all come from somewhere else. In one way or another, we are all a nation of immigrants. Some of us came for economic reasons. Some came fleeing war or political oppression. Some came simply to try to find a better life for their children. What must it be like to uproot lives, families, to leave the familiar and travel thousands of miles to a place perhaps that you have only read about? So the series of conversations over the next month will explore some of this, and we're going to meet people who come from all over the world to our country and to this city. When I was growing up in Toronto back in 1901, the city was white, Protestant, and it was exceedingly boring. I left when I was 18. I couldn't wait to get out of Toronto. Now, of course, it's, I think, the world's most multicultural, multilingual city. And the schoolhouse is an appropriate venue for our discussion because Enoch Turner devoted much of his life to teaching the children of immigrants. And as I said, we're calling the series Arrival. So tonight, 3 people who came as young children to this country and this city. I'm going to ask you to identify yourselves, give us your name, when you arrived, what age, and where you came from. And Sarah, I'll start with you.
My name is Sarah. I came to Canada when I was 9 years old in the year 2000. And I came from Cuba with just my parents. We didn't really know anybody here.
Great. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ian Barcarse. I was born and raised in the Philippines and moved to Canada when I was 8 to be reunified with my mom, who came here much earlier on as part of the Caregiver Live-In program in Canada.
or Canada.
Hi. Is it okay if I don't hold the mic? Can you hear at the back? Is it just like this? Okay. So, my name is Farzana Doctor. My family came in 1971 when I was a baby. We are originally from India, but we came en route via Zambia, where my family lived for 5 years.
Terrific. Can everybody hear? Everybody up here? A hand at the back. You can't hear us? No? I'm sorry? Okay, terrific. Great, good. Let me start this conversation with you. You were 8 when you came to Canada. Is that right?
Me? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me about your memories of your first days in Canada, in Toronto.
In Canada. I arrived here March 25th, like I know to the day, and it was a snowy sort of, we arrived at the airport, got into the car, and I looked out the window and I was like, this is the stuff I see in movies, right?
Did you have any winter clothes? No.
Pardon?
Did you have any winter clothes?
I had a sweater, so I felt that first bitter cold of winter. It was sort of in the evening hours, so I also just looked up at the sky and saw, I guess, the lights of Highway 401 with all the snow coming down. So that was my first impression.
Were you nervous? Were you frightened?
Was I nervous?
Frightened. Yeah.
Frightened. Yeah, there was a lot of uncertainty with my move and my reunification. Again, my mom came here, 6 months after I was born. So I was predominantly raised by my grandmother and my aunts and my uncles back in the Philippines. And so I knew of my mom as sort of this faraway figure that I received letters and phone calls and occasional trips to the Philippines. But really coming here, I think I was told that this was a vacation. I didn't actually know that this would be my final destination or that there wouldn't be a return trip home. And through the many years, the early stages, it was getting to know who my mom was, what is a mom, what does that family unit look like, which is very different from sort of my upbringing in the Philippines.
A bit later, I want to get into your work histories, because I know, Ian, you have a very interesting one, as do your colleagues. But I want to ask Sarah, coming from Cuba, what was it like?
It was interesting. We luckily came in the spring, so we didn't have to face full-on winter right from the get-go. But I remember being absolutely terrified because I didn't have any concept of central heating and cooling. And I just knew that back home, when it was a cold day, taking a shower was the worst thing ever. And I remember just thinking, like, how's it going to be being in Canada when it's really, really cold for months? It was fantastic to learn that there's actually heating indoors. One of the greatest inventions there is, along with the hot water. But I had a similar experience where the first sort of shocking memory that I have was just the cab ride to the hotel when we first arrived and just seeing the 401. And I remember thinking there can't be that many people, let alone that many cars. How is that possible? And they're all just driving and there's people just like me inside each one. It was just a very different scale than what I was used to dealing with. So.
Farzana, you were an infant when you came from Zambia, but as you grew, what was the scariest thing for you with your family?
For people like me who are so small, like to not have the actual arrival memory. Most of my early memories are of my parents' stress, my parents' uncertainty, my parents' questioning, my parents' loneliness. So, I have memories of, for example, they would invite people over for dinner and then not get invited back. They would try to examine, what was this about? Like, was it a cultural difference? Was it that they were being, objective? So this kind of time of great loneliness for them because we didn't really have family involved.
What did your parents tell you about this place and these people? What were you learning as you were growing up? Go ahead, anyway. Ian or Sarah?
I think because we had a lot of tourism in Cuba, and my dad also for a while worked as a tour guide. My parents both had a really positive opinion of Canadians, especially in comparison to Americans. And so they were thrilled when they found that they were able to come to Canada, and they were expecting people to be, I guess, welcoming, and for the most part they were, but we are very used to people being very close and very sociable and very immediately friendly in our culture, and that sort of distance that Canadians like to have socially was the part that was shocking to us. And there was definitely a lot of what was mentioned before, the loneliness, the feeling like you're not sure if something is because you've done something wrong or if it's just the culture is different. So I can definitely relate to that.
Ian, what about you? What did your folks tell you about Canadians? Did you know anything about Canadians before you came?
So the Philippines being an English-speaking country, we were predominantly watching North American media. So I grew up with the Power Rangers and all sort of like these English-speaking sort of media. So I knew what the US and Canada sort of were. And so all the Philippines, the rhetoric is you're making it out, right? By you going to Canada, you've made it. You're not staying here. You're going somewhere else. So that's
did you know that the whole idea of the Filipina nanny in this country, are thousands of nannies taking care of our children?
I definitely didn't know that. I mean, I knew it through the stories of my mom when she'd call home and tell me that, oh, I'm taking care of a boy that's the same age as you, right? And it's like when I hold him at night or put him to sleep, I think of you. And so I know it through those stories, but I definitely didn't know the grandness of it until sort of much later on, and understanding how so much of it is driven through policies and migration pathways, and that, you know, it was all very intentional.
But was it odd to have your mother taking care of another child roughly your age? Did that?
It was strange. When we first moved in, the family that she's taking care of had a son that was the same grade as. So when I moved here in March, they put me right into the same school, the same class. And so I just knew this boy named Matthew, who my mom takes care of, is now my classmate, my go-to friend. But then we go back to his place so that, you know, we're playing, doing homework while my mom is cooking and cleaning and getting the house prepared for when the parents come. So there's that.
Farzana, was it difficult to make friends?
I grew up in Whitby, and Whitby at the time was not a suburb of Toronto. It was a small white town. At my school, there was one Black family, one Chinese family, one Indian family, us. So it was a little bit, I mean, I wouldn't have had an awareness that those differences were at play. But I think they were. There was a way that we would get othered, and we were seen as very different and quite foreign, and that was difficult. And there was quite a bit of bullying as well.
Tell me about that, because that bullying, of course, is an ongoing, continuing issue in this country.
And kids bully and get bullied for all kinds of reasons, right? Like it's the unfortunate part of our culture, but for me, it was around race and racism, right? So I definitely had, you know, the nice friends, but I also had kids who, you know, called names and did other kinds of things that were.
What kind of names were you called? Because you're a Black person, a brown person, and Ian is as well. Color was an issue for you guys?
Yeah. We were called Paki back then. That was the term that was very common in the 70s. I don't know that that's used as much these days, but and I had friends who were growing up in Toronto, and they were also being called Paki, even though there were so many more South Asian kids around. They weren't such a minority like we were in Whitby. So yeah, I think it was difficult.
Did you feel in your gut that you were in a minority and likely to stay that way? I mean, was it something that that enlivened you, made you want to succeed, or was it something that was depressing?
You know, it was something that we didn't talk about.
You
So
didn't?
It was something that was just hard to identify and confusing. So, you know, one of the things I think my parents did for a sense of safety was they really encouraged assimilation. So they didn't push us to learn Gujarati, our mother tongue. We didn't do a lot of religious activities. And so there was the sense of like, I'm like these people, but I'm not like these people. But I should try to definitely be these people. So that was confusing. Because
So-
you can't be.
Was there tension in your families about whether to assimilate or to retain your natural identity? What, you're both nodding. Sarah, what?
Yeah, I think there's a sense of, you know, we came to Canada so that we could have the opportunity to be ourselves, to be different, to be better in some ways than what our culture would impose on us. But at the same time, there's this undertone of, you know, you're not Cuban enough, or no, you've become too Canadian now. You speak too softly, or you have different values, or just either way, it's wrong. You're either too much on one side or too much on the other, and you're never in the right balance, regardless of what mixed setting you're in. If you're with Canadians, you don't quite fit in because you don't have those same experiences. But if you're with Cubans, you don't fit in because you no longer have their lifestyle. So it's a very weird sort of in-between stage.
It's a kind of demographic schizophrenia, isn't it? One or the other, and that's the tension
Yeah,
in that equation there. Ian, what about you?
Yeah, I definitely relate to that. I mean, I was fortunate to have grown up predominantly in like the Toronto Catholic District School Board, where, you know, there was a great mixture of sort of backgrounds and a high percentage of Filipino students. So I don't think I necessarily had that experience where I was the only or the minority. But interestingly enough, those bullying incidents actually doesn't stop or the boundaries of race. It's not white folks doing that to marginal.
It wasn't.
For me, it was actually within the Filipino community in terms of how well can you assimilate. So it's everything from you don't bring that lunch because it smells, or you have to work on your accent so that you don't sound so foreign. And then the key words for us would be, oh, you're a fob. So this would be Filipinos on Filipinos saying, don't be a fob. Learn to speak without the accent. Only eat appropriate food in front of folks that doesn't smell, that won't be offensive. And this is all to sort of signal what it is to be Canadian or to erase.
But did you feel then you were losing something, that you're losing an element of your identity?
Yeah, I was fortunate that my mom was very strong in when you come home, I don't care how many languages you're learning in school, you're speaking our mother tongue Tagalog, right? Like, so I never lost that. But I know a lot of my peers were influenced to let go of their language. Like they knew how to speak it when they got here, but somehow 2 or 3 years down the road, all of a sudden it doesn't sound so right, or oh, I can't remember that word, and out of practice.
I'm
Right.
so envious.
Really?
I'm envious that you still have it. Yeah.
Right, but I that's because my mom's like, I don't care if you're learning French and English at the same time. This is and to her it was when you come home you need to be able to speak to your grandmother, right? So that was really
You're talking about bullying and racism, both of which are still with us. What were the positive elements to this? Churches, religion, you mentioned Catholic Church. What were the positive things about it?
I was exposed to a lot of things that I had no idea about. Just the idea of different cultures, different religions, different languages even was something that I vaguely knew about. But as a child, actually coming to Canada, walking downtown Toronto for the first time and seeing people around me that look just completely different from what I'm used to, and they're all living together. That was definitely a unique experience for me and something to see. There were a lot of learning moments in the early days.
For example, what kind of a?
I think more just I was lucky that I went to a school that had a lot of immigrants also going in there. So a lot of kids were going through a very similar experience to mine, even if the cultures were different. And so I remember having a lot of moments of, they couldn't understand what I was referring to when I was talking about my my national anthem from Cuba. That was just a part of my daily ritual and going into school. But they would say, "Oh, but I remember when I was going into school in wherever, we had our national anthem, and I remember we all just like sang it to each other, and there were like 5 national anthems going on." And we were just like learning about what the words were and what they meant and why they were significant to our countries. And we noticed that there were a lot of similarities between them. And so there was like a sharing of history told from the perspective of 9-year-olds. Probably not very accurate
Right.
at all. But it felt like even though we were very different from where we came from, we had all these things in common. And we had a shared theme to our history. And that sort of brought us together. It was an interesting learning experience.
The Philippines, I think am I correct? It's a Catholic country.
Yes.
What was the influence, if there was any, of the church and the religion on you as a young immigrant?
Oh, I mean, yeah, it definitely instills a sense of, I guess, obedience is what I would say. It's like you need to know the rules and then stay within the rules. Sort of growing into my own as a gay man, it was definitely one of those, how do I deal with those tensions with my own religion that I know it's a sin, I know I'm not accepted, I know this is what marriage is supposed to look like or what family is supposed to look like. So you very much sort of feel like who I am goes against everything that I know and where I come from.
Farzana, what about you?
With religion or?
About religion or the influences on you, positive?
Yeah, so plenty. I think I've heard like similar kinds of things. Just once I got out of Whitby, I did have the experience of lots of diversity and lots of expression and lots of opportunities. So one of the first things that I did when I came to Toronto was I started going to, for people who are a bit older in the crowd, they might remember a festival called Desh Pradesh. And Desh Pradesh ran for about 10 years, and it was this South Asian festival of like labor and queerness and all kinds of stuff that was like left-leaning and equity seeking and all of that kind of stuff. And it was my first opportunity to kind of come and be part of a festival where there were people like me who were caring about some of the same kinds of things. And so I think that maybe small town life in the early 70s didn't offer much of that. It offered lots of trauma instead. But, I think the larger cities and a little bit later in time, it became more positive.
In 1956, the Hungarian Revolution, many Hungarians came to Toronto. And some of the children came to the school that I attended. And I remember the nuns telling us to be very kind to these young people and treat them really nicely and remember they're foreigners. When did you stop being foreigners?
So there's often, I don't know if the two of you would agree, but there's often this experience of like you're a Canadian citizen if you're a Canadian citizen. So there's that, but there's a sense of like, you're always being asked, where are you from? I'm 51, so this has been going on for 50 years. Where are you from? Where are you from? No, where are you really from? And then you go back to wherever, your family originated from and you don't fit there. So there is this kind of chasm of like, you don't belong here, you don't belong there. So, by nationality, I'm not a foreigner, but there is this sense of, do you really belong?
Do you have friends, I know I do, who are Black and they're born in Toronto, but they're always asked where they're from? Is that common, you think?
In my experience with the brown person.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever, I think I'm fortunate to look like what I am. Like most folks will go Filipino, right? Like it's almost like a game for them. Like I know you, you're the tan one, right? Like, but I think what's more interesting is sort of the associations that come with that. Even to this day, being a professional, mostly in boardrooms that don't have people that look like me. I know folks come with a sense of care and trying to relate, but oftentimes it's, oh, you're Filipino. I love insert food, right? I love adobo. I love ube. I love all this kind of stuff. Or they'll go, oh, my nanny is Filipino. My caregiver is Filipino.
My gardener.
We love it. Pardon? Right, right. So these associations are often related to how are you of service or how do we enjoy your culture and that celebrity, right? And celebrity is a whole other thing because the only way Filipinos tend to reach fame is if they're only half of it, if you've noted. A lot of them are half of something. So then you're the perfect mix to be exotic, but then also acceptable. So there's a lot of tension going.
When you're growing up, you're watching television, you're going to movies, and then the internet came along. And did you see people like you represented in the media? When you looked at a newspaper, a magazine, or a movie, you didn't. You're shaking your head.
I remember when I got to see Deepa Mehta's film Fire.
Yeah,
That was just amazing.
even that is fabulous.
Right. Or there was this other Mississippi Masala came out. Like so these are films that came out quite a while ago, and those were some moments where I was like, oh look, right. So I don't think there was much. Again, we came in 1971, so there wasn't the same kind of representation. Now there's lots of South Asians on TV, thank goodness. But
Sarah?
It's kind of funny. I've had a somewhat opposite experience in that if I tell people I'm from Cuba, there's actually a not insignificant chance that they'll tell me, no, you're not. Apparently, I look white enough that I'm fully Canadian from the minute that I'm here. But I'm sorry, can you repeat the question from before?
Well, just the idea of looking for yourself in the commonly shared medium.
I think the experience I've had is that people think that because I'm white and therefore I must be Canadian, that I relate to them in a way that I don't necessarily. They think that I have shared experiences that I don't have. I have had a lot of comments sometimes when people assume that I am just as racist as they are. And I've had a lot of comments from people saying like, okay, something along the lines of, immigration is destroying this country. And like, okay, I'm going to keep quiet about the fact that I'm an immigrant. But then they might say something like, well, I don't mean someone like you. And it's very obvious that they can only be referring to the fact that I'm white and not where I'm from or the way that I got to Canada or my politics or any of that.
Does it, when people talk, I just wonder if it pisses you off when people talk about communism and the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, all of those historical touchstones. Does it bother you to be kind of not labeled, but you're a party to it?
I think one thing that bothered me a lot, especially as a child, was people thinking that they know more about my history than I do and thinking that they know more about my own experiences than I do. I had a music teacher that was determined to convince me that my parents did not come to Canada through the independent immigration program, but actually we must have gotten on a boat. Like I remember being on an airplane. We were not on a boat. I know people that were on boats, but that wasn't us. And she really just told me that I was wrong, flat out just said I was wrong and said it in front of the entire class. I'm still bitter about that. But I have had a lot of experiences like that where people say, well, no, actually, Cuba is actually like this. Like, no, I know what it's like.
Yeah.
I'm from there. I have family there. I go back there.
they maybe know what the all-inclusive resorts are like. That's
Yeah.
probably what they know, right?
Exactly.
That's astounding. People tell you what your country or background or culture is all about.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that? I mean, the flat out insult of that.
As a child, you mostly don't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's
you believe it. Or I did.
You internalize it.
Internal.
Yeah.
Ian, did you and your family kind of seek out established Filipino institutions, cultural or religious, whatever? In other words, did you gravitate toward people who were already here and established and they've been here for years?
Yeah, so I grew up around the Baptist and Wilson community, which has a high proportion of Filipinos living there. I don't know whether or not you seek it out intentionally. There's certainly a certain level of community and comfort, but it really, when you're new to the country, you're looking for folks who look like you, who can understand you, and there's this really strong network of just giving back, of paying it forward. So those who have come before us, if there's any way they can provide a bed for a month or food for a month just to get someone started, right? Like, because they know it too. And so even to this day, my mom is constantly like, I heard some so-and-so's cousin is coming here. We're going to fix the bed or the sofa and just to make sure that they can do it. So I think that's how that community gets attracted to one another. I don't know if we necessarily seek it out, but it definitely is a place to start.
A lot of people come here for a newfound economic freedom, better life for their children and so on. Tell me a bit about what it's like to get to work. Is it difficult to find jobs early on?
I can tell you about my dad. So my dad was working as a doctor in Zambia for many years. And then he came here and had to do another, I think, 4 years at Dalhousie before he could be qualified to work. So
Do you know how many doctors driving cabs are in this city?
Yes. And I think that was when it was easy. That was in 1971. I think it's gotten harder. Yeah.
At least for my mom, she left the Philippines, graduated as a civil engineer, and
She was a graduate civil engineer.
Yeah, and so she came here with the education's not qualifying. And I've often asked her, the common question of, why didn't you go back, or why didn't you try to get your education to qualify? And she's like, think about it. Even before you came, I was working 3 jobs, and there's this, a big part of the Filipino culture is remittances back home. That like folks who are working here send more than half of their paycheck back to the Philippines to keep their family home alive. So she's like, I'm working 3 jobs to make ends meet with rent, food, and I was sending money back home or filling up boxes to send goods back home. When was I going to do that? And when you came, the priority became making sure you went.
But she couldn't get work as a civil engineer, is that?
No, none of the education would cross over qualifying.
Because she wasn't qualified.
That's right. That's true.
My parents were the same. They were both engineers. We came to Canada through the independent immigration program. They specifically wanted highly educated immigrants in like engineering and that kind of position, just doctors. But then you get to Canada and you're not actually qualified to do anything. My dad got a job at a warehouse working night shift. My mom was able to secure an office job that was somewhat related to what she was doing before, but definitely not on the same level. She was underpaid for years and years. And she also struggled because of the language, so she couldn't just go back to school for engineering. She had to first get through the first hurdle of the English language. We threw a party for her the first day that she was able to pronounce the word absolutely properly. That was a little family milestone. And she did eventually get some additional schooling, but it was never going to be at the same level where she was before.
Have any of you ever thought that it has nothing to do with qualification? That these self-governing professions want to keep their numbers down to make it nice for them, so they don't want newcomers.
And
You ever
there's
thought about that?
There's also an assumption that maybe the education that they would have been getting in their home country is not as good, perhaps. There's an assumption, a racist assumption of that, right? Because you would think like an engineer is an engineer and is an engineer anywhere across the world, right?
Yeah.
like.
But
no
a,
stuff.
a doctor in Zambia is not as qualified as a doctor in Penticton. Is that it?
I guess so. Yeah.
I guess want to point out, it's interesting when you say, like, you distinctly say we went through what is it, which immigration pathway? Like independent,
Independent immigrant,
right.
yeah.
So for most Filipinos, when they come here as part of the live-in caregiver program,
Yeah.
attached to their ability to stay in the country is to stay being a babysitter or a house cleaner for X number of years, right? So you're actually coming here knowing you're signing up for a certain profession for a certain number of years. So even the idea of retraining and getting yourself prepared for your next step seems like a very long, distance away.
What was it like for you? Because you have a very respectful job,
Mhm.
head of communications at York University.
Mhm.
How did you get there? No, please, I don't want to sound surprised.
Yeah.
Like, how the hell did you make it? What were the steps you had to go through? How did you navigate that?
I will say, growing up in white households, seeing what could be, definitely fed into my ambitions of who I can be. Even though I grew up in the Bathurst and Wilson community with high populations of Filipino peers, a lot of us don't make it out of there because who you know in the environment you're in can sometimes define opportunities. And so strangely enough, the fact that my mom would bring me to her workplace where she was cleaning the large kitchens and cleaning the living rooms gave me an aspirational quality of what could be that some of my peers may not have had. And so when thinking about how I grew as a professional, a lot of it for the longest time was, you talk about imposter syndrome. I literally had to build an identity in myself, like that is the white Ian. Like, how do you be the whitest person to make it in these systems of power?
Sarah, you're a paralegal.
Yeah, legal assistant.
Yeah, that's a high stress job for one thing, isn't it?
It can be. It can be. Really enjoying my current job. It's with in Wilson Estates.
But were there problems in getting to where you are? How did you overcome them? I'm very interested in people who are faced with terrible circumstance, difficulty, and somehow manage to navigate their way through. How did you do it?
I think my family had very high ambitions for me compared to what I had for myself, but I do come from a family of a lot of doctors and engineers and high-level professionals, but that's back home. And I think one thing that was a little difficult to explain was that here, so much of your schooling, especially high-level schooling, is tied to how much money you can make in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
But even just, trying to get extra tutoring, that sort of thing is a new consideration that they maybe didn't have before. In terms of how I made it, I think I just got lucky for the most part. I had some good opportunities, but at the same time, I just happened to luck out into interviews with people that took a chance on me, even though we didn't have any connections or any kind of references. I didn't know anyone in the legal field. I didn't have anyone vouch for me, and it's definitely a field in which you need somebody vouching for you, or you're never going to get anywhere. It was, I'm thankful for the people that took a chance on me at the very beginning. At the same time, I feel like I shouldn't have that feeling of, oh, wow, I just got so incredibly lucky. It shouldn't be that way. Everybody should get a chance based on their merits, based on their schooling, based on their own abilities to get a foot in the door, and not everybody does.
Farzana, you picked, or it picked you, one of the most difficult areas of professional life in this country. That is a novelist and poet. Obviously weren't that in Zambia, but we don't think much of our poets.
There originally, in my family had quite a lot of class privilege. Eventually, after a few years, we had a lot of stability, and
In Whitby.
we became middle class, and then we became upper middle class. But I had always been a creative kid. I, said, I want to be an actor, I want to be a playwright, I want to write, I want to do all kinds of things. And they were like, that can be a hobby, because, immigrant parents are all about financial security, which is like really good and smart.
Sure,
I think that. And so I was really pushed to do something more practical. So that's how I ended up becoming a psychotherapist. So I'm a psychotherapist in the afternoon. I did it full time for many, many years, but now I do it in the afternoon. I do the writing in the morning because I believe in financial security.
Of course.
And it is hard to be a writer.
Are you a Zambian writer or a writer who happens to be Zambian?
Well, I actually more identify as with the Indian heritage because, although I was born in Zambia, we were just there for 5 years. So the longer history is in India. So I just think of myself as a writer. I'm also, part of Hamlet, whatever,
Yeah, whatever, yeah.
But yeah, I think it's only the marginalized writers who really get pushed into narrowing down, all the intersectional identities that they belong to, and then attaching that to writer. So as much as I can, I sort of avoid that.
Do you write every day?
Yeah.
It's difficult, isn't it?
It is, it's really difficult.
One of my favorite,
You write every day too, but
well, one of my favorite authors, Amy White, said that writing is quite simple. You just type the, and then 2 hours later you type hell with it. We were talking about racism earlier, bullying. You wrote a poem about that, did you? Could you read it tell us the title and read it for us?
Happy to. So
And the book is called?
You Still Look the Same. So this is I mostly write novels, but this was my first poetry collection and it just came out this spring. So this is a poem. Oh, sorry, I picked the wrong one. I was going to pick You Still Look the Same. And I'm going to just look for that. Sorry.
And we can get that at fine bookstores everywhere, can't we? I mean, it's out.
Yes, that's fine. Everywhere. Okay, here we go. This is called You Still Look the Same. And this is for a childhood friend named Susie. We met in grade 2, had mean Miss Edmonds. This is my memory, not yours. I learned the term best friend that year, claimed you. Together we went to Brownies, swam with Dad, weeded Mom's lilies. At recess, a boy called you Packy. This is your memory, not mine. I explained the meaning, pulled back your mitten, exposed goose pimpled flesh. It's what they call me. But you from Portugal and me, India, foreign for small towns. In grade 3, we had pregnant Mrs. Fields, your parents' divorce. Before the year was up, you disappeared, left me alone. This is my memory, not yours. Facebook reunites us 30 years later, but it takes 7 more to meet for dinner. We parse out memories about olive and brown-skinned girls, tell each other you still look the same.
That's beautiful. Yes. Now, in addition to actively pursuing a poverty-stricken career like writing, you're a political activist as well.
Yeah, I've been involved in
With a big issue,
lots of causes for a lot of years, yeah.
but a major one. You're involved. Tell us about that. It's
So-
not a very pleasant topic,
No, it's not
but
very pleasant. It's a
it's
little
important.
bit of a trigger warning. So, I come from a community called the Dawoodi Bora community, and it's one of the communities of the world. This, by the way, happens in over 90 countries of the world, but it's one of the communities that practices a form of female genital cutting. And we have a vibrant group of gory feminists from, people from our community who are fighting this practice and trying to end it. And so I've been involved with that for the last 5 years.
It's going on in Canada, is it?
Yes, and it's important to know that. That this-
Certainly is. And I think a lot of people would be shocked at that.
Yeah, it's incredibly like more common than people imagine. Most people think that it happens only in certain countries in Africa, but as more, we're having a bit of a Me Too movement around this issue. And as more and more people speak up, we're finding out that it's, happening all across, all across Asia, many places in Africa, the Middle East, parts of South America, parts of Russia, and so on and so on. So it's a very common, terrible practice.
Is in all of this activity and activism, where are the men?
More and more they're joining us, which is really good.
Are they saying, stop,
Yes.
halt, it's my sister, my wife, my mother?
Slowly they're coming on board.
Slowly.
It used to be a very silent issue. It still kind of is. It's very taboo to discuss. And so a lot of people were actually shocked that it happened in our community. We're known to be progressive in lots of ways. And so people were quite shocked. And so this was a practice that was happening. The high religious leader says it has to happen. The women enforce it, and it's mostly kept secret from the men. So until recently, most men didn't even know it happened.
So if I were to be critical of the practice, does that mean, or is it taken to mean that I'm critical of the religion, culture?
We thought that way, but it's no longer, because globally there are, millions of feminists fighting this, and they come from all different religions and backgrounds. And let me just do a little pitch. There's a network in Canada called the End FGM Network, Canada Network. They can be found at endfgm.ca. And
Female genital mutilation.
yes, and
Give the
they want-
address again.
they want everyone to join. So endfgm.ca.
I think, as I said earlier, I think people be shocked to know that it is prevalent and how prevalent it is. It's against the law, for God's sake.
Yes, it's been against the law for a long time in Canada, but there really isn't anything that's being done to kind of keep stats or prevent it, and it's just very recently that money has gone into creating education around it.
When you hear things like this, talking about a particular practice, in this case, a heinous, barbaric practice, but does that tend to mark you in some way as being foreign and different? And do you know what I'm getting at? Is it,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead. Anybody, yeah. Rosanna?
Well, if you have anything to jump in.
Jump
let's
in.
talk about, if there's anything you want, I don't know if there, this is definitely something in our community that does mark us as being different. And I think you were talking before, just the stereotypes that happen against your communities. This is a very, people need to have a very nuanced understanding of these issues to be able to step in and really do anything about it. It's when we create the stereotypes that there's no way there's going to be any kind of change. So I don't know if anything.
But people don't, but do people look at things that calmly and that right? I mean, I know a lot of people think that every Irish is a drunk, and every Irishman can spout poetry and, is in love with death, and really don't want to go any further. And maybe some people don't want to go any further than what they know about FGM.
There's a lot of unthinking people, right? Just even those stereotypes against Irish people still exist when there are so many people of Irish descent in this country is ridiculous, right?
I guess if I could just contribute in the general conversation around stereotypes, right? And where that's all coming from. Again, even in the world of academia, I work at a university, right? So looking at Filipino Canadian scholarship, what's being noticed now is just how much of the research and the data is related to the live-in caregiver migration program that's happening. In one hand, it's great visibility, great to have the data, great to have the knowledge. But in what ways does the focus on one type of Filipino narrative reduce the possibilities of other forms of Filipino narrative, right? And so it's this idea of how do stereotypes then limit our understanding of a whole culture and identity and country to one type right? And so
Yeah,
it's this idea, then it's, for me, then it's up to us, being members of that community, to do something about that, to diversify the understanding, to educate others around, other forms of interpretation.
Are there stereotypes about Cubans? I'm not aware of, except they're supposed to be very good baseball players and they play the guitar well, but I don't really know.
I think it's funny, there are some stereotypes that are false because they're borrowed from other cultures. So a lot of people are very surprised to know that I can't handle spicy food. In Cuba, we just don't have it, but of course it's common in some parts like Mexico and some parts of South America. And so they assume, well, it's Latin America, so here's all the jalapenos, and I can't actually handle that.
Right.
I also can't dance, just for the record. But yeah, there's a lot of stereotypes. I think some of them are kind of funny in that they're the opposite, that people believe that because I'm Cuban, I must be very communist. And actually, with my family left Cuba because we weren't very communist. But there's also the stereotype of the type of immigration that comes out of Cuba, and it's more positive in Canada because Canada has had a lot of people from, for example, the independent immigration program. But for example, in the States, where you have a lot of people settled in Florida that came through other means or were more desperate, had fewer means to get by once they were there, and created their own little community where they're more isolated. Stereotypes are maybe not as positive. So if I visit the States, I can actually see that mentality shifting when people learn that I'm from Cuba, where, come up here to Canada and people say, oh, that's great, that's wonderful. They want to know more. Go down to the States, not so much.
When I was growing up in Toronto, getting into some baseball internationally, before every game, they played three anthems. The Canadian anthem, the American anthem, and the Cuban anthem. The Havana Sugar Kings were a terrific baseball team. And we didn't really have any of that American paranoia, I think, about the little island 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Yeah.
If I could just sort of interject, so it's interesting that you're making these connections of, how you're sort of being grouped or categorized under a very grand scheme of things. It's interesting for me because I think for most Filipinos, when people think of Asian, there's certain nationalities, right? Like Chinese, Vietnamese, maybe Japanese or Korean. Filipinos are often not.
Are what?
And that are often not included in the common definition or understanding of what
Why is
Asians
that?
are, and even because Asian's such a large term, right? Like even breaking out Southeast Asian versus like South Asians, and so like how did that clearly what you're saying is the grouping doesn't help.
It doesn't. I mean, at least for me, Cuba's a very isolated sort of island nation, so there's less transference of culture. Of course, there's still some. I have a lot in common with other Latin Americans, but there's also a lot of things that are going to be very foreign to me about them. But it is very difficult. I mean, if you're a Canadian, to sort of keep in mind the idea of the different cultures of every single country that's out there, and sometimes within countries there's subcultures. You can't expect one person to keep track of it all. As humans, we sort of group people together, almost out of necessity. But when you start to make assumptions about it, that's when it gets
Right.
it's much tougher.
Yeah.
But do you have to carry the sins, not the sins, but the perceptions of other? For example, in African nations, every time there's a coup or something, or some ruler goes to jail for crime, does it affect you? I mean, do people say, well, it's Africa, for God's sake, they're all savages anyway?
Like, again, when we're talking about how all this affected us as children, the thing that I said earlier was that, like, you just internalize all of these ideas, right? And so over time, hopefully you have like the right people around you to be able to disentangle all of that and unlearn all of the wrong messages. And then over time, you just kind of figure out like what you have the energy for, right? So are you going to take it up with someone, or are you going to walk away from that conversation, right? So, there's definitely situations where racist comments will deeply hurt me, and other times where I'll just be like, shields up. No, thank you. Yeah.
It really resonates with me. Sorry if I may interrupt. When you say you have to choose what you have the energy for. I just recently made the decision to change my name after getting married, which is not a common thing in my culture. And a big part of the reason is I don't have the energy to, there's a space that I have two separate last names. There's a space between them, and the system in Canada just doesn't it doesn't do it. And I don't have the energy to always go through the process of having to change my voter registration card because they misspell it every time, or send me two and they're both wrong. I don't have the energy to go in person to explain that I'm changing my address or need to renew my driver's license just because the online process won't let me. I don't have the energy to put, I almost didn't get into university because my school told them that I don't exist. And nobody bothered to notify me because there's nobody to notify because I don't exist. And all of these things just take energy, they take work. And I made the decision that that's just not something that I'm willing to do anymore. It's not a fight that I'm willing to keep fighting every year of my life, every time I have to file my taxes.
Yeah, that must get very tiring.
It,
Never mind infuriating, but just the sheer energy output.
it's funny because you look at it sort of in a vacuum of each time you have to do it, and it's just just a few extra minutes here, or you have to make one little extra trip there, or send out a few more forms. But it adds up, and it just sort of wears down at you. When I introduce myself, I sometimes just don't mention my last names because I don't want to get into it. I don't know how to pronounce it in English. I just don't. There's no right way. You're not going to get it wrong. I'm not going to be offended. But then you have to go through that spiel every single time. Or if I'm spelling it out, I have to explain like there's a space, there's no hyphen. And if they ask me, I have to like go into the whole background of, we get one last name from the mother, we get one last name from the father, and that makes the child's name, which is very interesting to a lot of people, and I'm happy to explain it, but I don't want to go through it every time I'm introducing myself.
Oh, by the way, we're open this up for questions from online and here in the studio audience. There are huge debates, as you know, about democracy and the future of it, if in fact it has a future. Pardon me. Do you see, are we in competition now with the South, nations of the South? Are we as Westerners, are we on the decline, do you think? Marcella, what?
It's such a big question.
Big question.
It is a big question, yeah.
It's a huge question. I don't know.
I mean, it's a very interesting question because it comes from a position of like, what is our benefit or what is our best interest from the West, right? Like, I think the reality of the technology and the world of the internet and social media is that we are much more globalized, as in our influences can come from all over the world, not just what we're seeing in mainstream media and what have you. But in terms of competition, then it goes into, for what? Militarism, labor, within those contexts, there's so much deeper conversations to be had of why is it even interpreted as competition? Like, why do we look at it from that deficit and gains perspective, right? So there's just a lot to unpack there, I think, as a question.
And the way that we live here in Canada is like a threat to so many other countries. What people who are looking at what was happening in Pakistan and the floods and all of that kind of thing. We're looking at the ways that like countries like ours just waste so much and create so much of what is creating global warming, right? So, maybe we should be turning that question on its head. I don't know. Sarah, you're working.
I mean, I hope democracy sticks around personally. I do think that something about what we consider the typical Western way of life has to be coming to an end in that, it's unsustainable in so many different ways. Partly it's unsustainable just in terms of resources.
But it's said by others a lot smarter than me that the whole question of democracy is imperiled especially in underdeveloped countries like the United States.
Certainly seems that way in recent years.
But
It is scary to watch because our parents came to this country. I think I can say to give us better opportunities, and part of that is the political aspect of it. Because we considered this to be the better option. And to see that sort of slipping and sliding in some ways towards what we were always afraid of is a little bit terrifying, because at that point, what do? Do you uproot your life again and try and find something better again? It was very difficult the first time. Or do you have an obligation to try and fight and prevent it from happening? They're big questions.
well, let me ask you.
It is a little scary how like disengaged people are,
Yeah.
like when we look at, how many people showed up to vote last time, in the provincial election, like
The lowest turnout ever.
it was frightening for me that like people were so, I don't know what their motivation was to not get involved, but so disengaged. And we have a big municipal election, and I hope that people go out and vote, because we have a lot of people who are incumbents, and there's this idea that the incumbents always win because people don't come out to vote. So how do we change things if people
Well,
don't participate?
in that mode of change, it could give us something, or two or three things, that we who are domesticated Canadians, and we've been here a long time, need to know about you who have come after us from all over the world. What should we know about you that's absolutely crucial? I'm thinking, how do you get rid of racism? It's, I don't even know the solution, but give me some idea that we could take away and say, okay, I now understand a bit more about me, you guys.
One thing that came to mind was, you were saying it's not possible for us to know about every single culture, every single country. Even if you're from some of those neighboring countries, you're not going to know everything. And I find that one way that is really helpful is to just have a lot of cultural humility. So, if I don't know anything about where you're from, let me start from that place in my head. Not that I'm going to interrogate you about, the 10 fast facts about your country or anything, but I'm just going to start from a position of, you probably have a lot of wrong ideas, and probably have a lot of unlearning to do. So that's the first, cultural humility position to start.
I've never heard that phrase. It's wonderful. It's a terrific.
Yeah.
It says an awful lot.
Yeah, and I think it's about creating space to listen and learn, right? Like, again, it's in those subtle conversations, and I've learned to not take offense to it when someone goes, oh, I know your food, or I know someone who works for me that does it. I know it's coming from a place of trying to relate, but I guess acknowledging that sometimes the ability that your attempt to relate can be very damaging and triggering, and it is not doing good. And so
Yeah.
again, going back to cultural humility, instead of trying to relate, it's just open to space, right? It's like, tell me more about you, not the category that I think you're in, not the background and history that I can relate to. It's that same idea of like, oh, I have a Black friend. It's like, why does it need to start that way, right?
Yeah.
Right? It's just like, tell me. So I guess it's learning to listen, learning to ask questions, and putting the other first, in terms of if that's truly what you're trying to do, right?
Sarah?
I think, yeah, there's something that happens with Canadians where they can safely assume that they have the same baseline. They have the same things that they're nostalgic for. They have the same values that they grew up with, and that might not necessarily be the same for everybody that comes here from another country. And I think that's where the difference lies, where you want to relate to someone. You want to be friends. You want to find that commonality that ties you together.
Yeah.
But it can be difficult in ways that you never even think about sometimes, like even just from the type of media that you consume at a young age, from the values that are instilled in you by your elders. Just assume that you're starting off in completely different quadrants. And then you find that as you do learn from each other, as you listen to what their experiences are like, the things that you do have in common are often the most surprising things that you never thought that you would, but you do. Like the fact that there's different the same themes in your national anthem, or something that you would think that would make you different actually is where you can start to find commonalities.
I think we forget, pardon me, sometimes that we get a lot out of it as well. Pardon me. We had a Filipino nanny for my youngest son, who's now 27. And she came and took care of him and did all of that. We thought, isn't that nice? Well, the long and short of it is she became a member of our family. She lives with us. She has her own apartment in the house. She doesn't take care of children anymore. She's a dental hygienist person. And she is a member of the family. And my sons treat her as such. And that's, I'm not saying that in a bragging sort of way, but we have learned so much from her. It's enriched, I hate the cliche, but it has enriched us incredibly, and she's just amazing. She can't get used to my drinking a martini every day at 5 o'clock. But she has her own life, her own friends, own church and stuff. And I can't think what the last 25 years would have been like without her. It would have been bearable, but empty. You know what I mean? Thank you all. That's just wonderful to see you. And we have some questions now. As I said, we would have, and I'm going to direct them to various members of the panel. Ian and Sarah, what was your impression of the Canadian school system, having come here as a student in your home country?
From an educational standpoint, I thought that Canada was so behind.
It was easier.
Yeah, it was so much easier. But at the same time, there were aspects that aren't just, the math that you're learning or the grammar that you're learning that I didn't have back home, which was the sort of caring about the mental well-being of the student aspect. The social aspect of making sure that the school is a clean and welcoming environment to go into, making sure that you're taught about things other than just what 2 + 2 is. I think that Canada has an education that's more well-rounded than what I was used to, but maybe it could focus a little more on the academics.
Ian?
Yeah, I agree. It was one of those, I was sitting there in my first scene, I'm like, you're just learning this? Like, oh, okay. So academically, I think there's a bit of rigor, but the approach is definitely very different. In the Philippines, at least when I was going there, school was privatized. So it was those who can afford it can go. Those who can't, don't. It's usually 3 shifts, so you don't have your own desk, your own space. You go in and out of classrooms, that kind of stuff. But when my one, I guess, vivid memory and in the school system that really made me realize, oh, I'm in a different place here is, again, I was raised by my grandmother, aunts, and uncles. And one year we were doing a Father's Day project. So I didn't grow up knowing my father. And so they said, cut out words in the magazine and decoupage it on a thing to make a pencil case. And so my teacher was walking around like, what word did you pick out? And so I said, I don't know, my dad. And that instant look of sadness and pity and made me realize how all of a sudden it's like, oh, the way I grew up isn't normal then. And this is when I started learning about what does the nuclear family look like? How is my upbringing different? And her response was, just imagine it anyways.
Oh my God.
So just go through the motions with everyone else and complete this art project. So then I brought it home to my mom. I said, I think this is supposed to be from my dad. But like these even art projects and the way the pedagogy,
Yeah.
the way we teach our kids is very telling of what Canadians value, what the norms are, and perhaps how others are different.
Your family was almost like a very limiting way to define family. Like, where do I fit on my aunts and uncles and cousins? Like, I'm
It's
just
immediate.
people. Yeah.
Farzana, this is for you. How does your experience as a child immigrant inform your practice as a physical therapist, or does it?
Psychotherapy, yeah, it does inform my.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
psychotherapy.
yeah, I feel, those early experiences probably impact everything that I do. Because I have this awareness of all of the things that we've been talking about. So I would be looking for, just now I was like, oh. Right, so, I definitely, help my clients deal with all kinds of racial trauma. And it has very much impacted how I write as well, and the kinds of characters I write. I'm often looking to fill a gap and create something where there isn't.
This is for all of you, any of you. When did you last return to your birthplace, and what was your impression?
When I was a kid, I used to go every summer, and it was very interesting to see sort of year by year how my initial impression that I had leaving as a child just became warped over time as things either deteriorated or just my view of it was more adult and had maybe a bit more understanding, a bit more information to draw on. My most recent trip was actually a few years ago, and I went with my now husband. And I got to introduce him to most of my family, which was, it was great, but at the same time, a little bit difficult for me because you're seeing all these people that were and still should be a bigger part of my life. And their circumstances are getting worse rather than better.
Ian, what about you? Have you been back?
Yeah, so in my nearly 30 years here, I've been back 3 times. My latest one was in 2018, and we made it a mission for our whole extended family that's all over the world to come back for family reunion. So that was really special. The interesting part is the Philippines has become a tourist hotspot, right? So a lot of folks know, like, oh, the white sand beaches of Boracay and Palawan, beautiful place. Most Filipinos go home and don't get to experience the tourist side of things because they go home to their families, right? They go home to the provinces. And so I don't think I've yet to experience the Philippines, I guess, the Canadian way or the tourist way. Still very much intimate, like on our family farm and sort of the day-to-day routines of going to the market and stuff like that.
Or is that, have you been to Zambia?
Never been to Zambia, but have been back to India many, many times because there's still a lot of family who are there.
What was your impression? What was your?
When I was young and I had internalized all the racism, I really felt like, I was coming from a superior kind of place. And over time, that became a different kind of vibe, and I'm much more humble about it. And I really see, I sometimes wonder, like, what would life have been like for us if we had stayed? What might have been better for us if we could have stayed? Would I have grown up differently? And also just to be around extended family. There's good and bad things about being too close to one's family, but
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder what that would be like.
Let me say another question. What upsets you or angers you the most about attitudes toward immigrants in Canada? Upsets you, or no, let me ask you and then down the table.
I think it's really just the racist idea.
The racism. Ian?
That they're here to exploit the system, whether it be healthcare and social security. That
You're exploiting our system.
right. That like, oh, you come here to take advantage of what we have built. Is the most common, I think, sort of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sarah?
About the same. and if I can build on that, I've definitely heard the criticism that rather than coming to Canada, you should have stayed home and tried to make that country better. And that you have some sort of social obligation to, just you as a single individual fighting against the system, make a stand, even if, it endangers your life, or even if it makes it so that you lose your opportunities. And just sacrifice all of that for the greater ideal of making the country better. Some people just want to live a normal life and raise a family and have something to look forward to, and think that tomorrow might actually be better than today.
These are two questions here, but they're actually the same. If your parents or you had to do it over again, would you have chosen Canada or another country? Sarah?
Definitely Canada. My parents tried to go to other countries before the independent immigration program opened up. And the second that they heard that Canada was an option, they really wanted to come here. And I'm glad that they did, because in another country, I might not have had the experience of not being the only one that's new to a country. I might not have gotten to learn about other people from other cultures, from other backgrounds that validate my own experiences, even if they are unique and different from my own.
But not the US, even though large Cubans in South Florida, no.
No, thank you.
No, thank you.
I like our healthcare better.
Yeah.
Among other things, but I think in Canada, the general atmosphere is more welcoming toward others than it would be in the States.
Ian, is that your feeling?
Yeah, every winter I ask my mom why I'm here. And she's like, really, I put papers in for Canada and California. Canada got back to me first, and that's where I went. But the reality is, like, our destiny is so just based on who opens their doors, right? And
Well, California's on fire right now.
so, I mean, I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm here, and with my lived experience and what I've been able to do. So, just grateful to still have a piece of home and being able to go home and keep both sides of the identity sort of intact. Yeah.
Farzana, what about you?
Same, yeah, it was who opened the doors first. And, in hindsight, right, like, probably they made a really good decision coming here. They had, I think the options were here in Australia. So, and I think that this is a more progressive place. So probably a good idea.
Were any of you, and this may wind up in this, but were any of you or all of you upset by the truckers convoy?
Yes.
Or did you were? Yeah. Ian, yeah.
Well, they were led by white supremacists, right? So, yeah,
White supremacists. Yeah.
yeah, that's who led them. They were called the KKK convoy, right?
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for being with us. The question.
Our online viewers?
Oh, any questions in the house, in the theater? Look at the hands go up. Yes, sir.
Whether you have experienced a moment, something at some point in time, where you felt that you fit in, that you actually were created, or the parents would be the right decision for you to do. Was there a moment in that experience or a group experience for
Thank you. That's a great question. Yes.
I think my first moment where I felt that way was when my parents got a call home from my school, just to say that I didn't need to be in ESL anymore.
Fabulous.
I thought that was pretty great. But it does sort of waver where sometimes you have those moments and you feel like, yes, I am definitely Canadian. This is who I am. And then sometimes you backslide, and then you have those moments where you suddenly feel alienated. So it's sort of a roller coaster of little tiny.
Farzana?
That's a good way to put it. Like it's a thing that arrives and then disappears and arrives and disappears. Yeah. I was just in the US this past weekend, and we were driving up to the border, and my partner and I were like, We're back. Like we were just waiting in the lineup to,
Yeah.
you know, at customs, but we were like big exhalation.
Yeah, I would say, I guess it's moments like these and sharing the stories, no matter where you come from, it's finding the connection points and relevancy, whether it be family, schooling, work, that gives you momentary sort of peace and like, oh, you get me. I think I would say perhaps rather than chasing fitting in, it's chasing being seen and being understood. That it seems more palatable, at least for me, because again, you never really feel like you fit in, but in moments and individual interactions, you can feel seen and heard and understood.
Thanks for the
Yes.
question.
Yes, ma'am.
Easier to immigrate as a child than it would have been as an adult because you have more time to assimilate?
In a lot of ways, yes. You don't have a lot of the responsibilities that you would have as an adult as well, and I think that makes a big difference. You're not stressed out about needing to find a job. But on the other hand, adults tend to be a little bit more sensitive in how they talk to each other than kids are in a playground, and I'm sure I got this a lot less than my peers here, but children are children. They're not intentionally cruel, but they can say things that will make you feel alienated in a way that you never will in any adult setting.
Ian?
I guess this ties into sort of my academic work in terms of, I actually research into international students and how they migrate here to Canada and the acculturation experience. And I would say it's not better or worse, it's just different, right? As kids, you're sort of figuring out the social, the familiar, that kind of thing. And then you're coming into adulthood, you're figuring out how to make money, where to live, like all those realities. So I think that there's distinct challenges, but there's research to say that at least for the Filipino context, if you are migrating here, like past the age of 8, like literally, like that was sort of like the cutoff point, you're less likely to pursue anything beyond a high school level education.
Really?
And find professional pathways that way, right? And so clearly there's a distinction and there's reasons for that. Yeah.
It's interesting, if it weren't for international students, a lot of universities would shut down. They'd go broke. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am, right here.
Pull from the roots, you had no say in them. Did you start to resent your parents for bringing you where you are? And if you did, how did you reconcile that as you grew up?
Jump in.
Yeah, I would say you resent your parents for many reasons. I think it does come out, through the day to day, and I think in the Filipino context, it's again, there's such a high positivity to leaving the country that you're just happy to be here. But there's certainly, looking back, the idea of growing up too early, the idea of like, my mom working 3 jobs, so I was holding down the home, or having to start work as early as possible to contribute to that household. But then I would say those resentments are misplaced, right? Like it's not necessarily your parent that may be doing the wrongdoing. It's the system that you're both navigating together. And so I think it's learning the separation of, it's not the person, it's the realities. It's the thing that you're living.
My parents always had a goal in mind of leaving Cuba as soon as possible. And I think they worked really hard to prepare me for that and to sort of make me optimistic about what life would be like in Canada. And certainly life in Canada, even though it wasn't what I had in mind originally, lived up to that. It was in so many ways so much better than anything that I could have imagined compared to being back home. I was always that I can remember grateful to my parents for making the transition. And I became aware of how difficult it was for them as I grew older, because as a child, I was still seeing it through the lens that they had given me of this is going to make life better. Aren't things so much better now? And I truly believed it in my heart because it was better for me, but all the challenges that they were going through were maybe a little bit invisible until I started just growing up and being able to relate to them a little better.
Any other questions here in the house? I want to thank the folks watching online for sending in questions, because it's really important to have you involved with the evening. And I have to thank our panel, if I can call them that, for your candor and your humor and your straightforward approach to things. It's so goddamn Canadian of you. Ian Barcarza, Farzana Doctor, and Sarah Robles Silva. The next event is Tuesday, October 25th. I hope you can join us either online or here in person. It's great to have you in person. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Good night.